Open Market is sponsored by AdLib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With AdLib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com today. Hi, I'm Joe Zappa, and this is Open Market, a podcast about building companies in the advertising industry. I'm joined by my co-host, Eric Franchi, and Eric Seufert. What's up, Eric?
Hey, how are you?
Wait.
Good to see you both.
Hold on. We need to set this up from the beginning. Please, it's Franchi or Seufert. Can't be saying, hey, Eric.
All right. I'll just use last names. We'll just act like we're on a high school baseball team.
Totally kidding. All right, awesome. Eric, thank you. Eric S., thank you so much for doing this. So for the audience, who I'm sure is very familiar with you, if they're not, Eric Seufert is a media strategist, quantitative marketer, author, and investor. You probably know him for his blog, Mobile Dev Memo, but he does a lot more. So Eric, just to set the stage, and this is the conversation we want to have because you've built a very unique business and empire. Can you quickly run us through all your various endeavors and projects that you have running at any given time?
Yeah. So currently I do a couple of things for, income or work, whatever you want to call it. So I run a venture fund called Hercules Capital that invests in kind of three focal categories. So ad tech, which is, just a kind of what you might expect that to mean. Publishing tech, which are tools that allow app developers to better monetize, better retain, to increase user engagement. That's mostly focused on, the consumer app side. And then content, so mobile apps, subscription apps, free-to-play games. And then this is all within the scope of mobile, right? So the aperture that I'm looking at of companies are those that operate within the mobile ecosystem. So that's one thing. The other thing is I run Mobile Dev Memo, which until 18 months ago was just a passion project. I didn't make any money from it. I've been running it since 2010 or 11 as just an unmonetized blog. And I introduced a paywall last April. And I started monetizing the site in that way with a subscription. I also started taking the podcast that accompanies the blog more seriously. And I now monetize that through Ari Paparo. So if anybody wants to advertise in the Mobile Dev Memo podcast, feel free to reach out to Ari. You can bundle it with this one, I believe. But so the Mobile Dev Memo now is kind of monetized via the subscription on the website and the podcast. The podcast is free to listen to. And then I would say about half of the articles I write on Mobile Dev Memo are also just free to read. And then I also do, a sort of limited, very selective amount of consulting, much less now than I used to. I have a couple of advisory roles, but that's kind of like the extracurricular stuff as I see it. And so that's me. I also, I've done a number of things in the past that, continue to generate income passively. So I have a marketing course that there's a interpretation of that's probably pretty negative, but I think mine is more substantive than like what you see a lot, what you see being promoted on Twitter. It's very long. It's 8 hours. It's video based, and it kind of goes into the weeds around quantitative marketing is how I'd call it. So that generates revenue. I wrote a book many years ago that continues to generate revenue. So those are the kind of the things that I do for money. But I'm in a very sort of privileged position now in my life where I can say that I really enjoy those things, and I would do them for free, as demonstrated by the fact that I did them all for free for a really long time. So I feel really lucky with where I'm at in my life.
Well, doing them all for free for a very long time is a topic I wanted to hit on because part of the reason I've wanted to have you on since we started the podcast is this is a go-to-market pod, and a lot of what we preach is the value of going directly to your audience and winning with thought leadership, essentially building awareness on your own terms, not necessarily relying on third-party gatekeepers, but doing things like putting content out on social, having a newsletter, having a podcast, and so on. And it seems to me that you're one of the leading examples in marketing, certainly in mobile,
of people who have built businesses on the back of what is essentially thought leadership. But I don't know if you would agree with that. But take me through like your having started the blog around like 2010 and done the book in I think around 2014 and how that affected your, various ventures and your career.
So I think I got the dates wrong. The blog, I want to say maybe it was 2012. So it's been more than a decade, right? But the sort of genesis of the blog was really just an act of self-preservation. So when I finished grad school, I went to grad school in Europe, and I went to a school called University College London. It's fairly highly ranked school, and I went there because I got a full ride scholarship. And so I went, and I didn't have any money, and I didn't have any family money, and so that was really the only way to go to grad school. And so I finished, and I studied applied economics, and I got a job at Skype. And the reason I got the job at Skype was, or one of the reasons was that I, did 1 year in grad school in London. And then the second year, the reason it was a full ride was it was part of this European Commission program, which is kind of ironic because I'm very critical of the European Commission now, but I owe them my graduate degree. They fully paid for, plus a stipend. It was very generous for living. So as part of one of the conditions of this program was, okay, you'd spend 1 year at the host university or the sort of home university, which is University College London. That was where the degree was from. But you had to spend a second year at some other European university. And the one I went to was in Estonia. And I kind of went kicking and screaming. I didn't want to go there. Luckily I did because I met my wife. Anyway, so I graduated from this university in Estonia, or I finished my research in this university in Estonia, and I got a job at Skype. Skype was essentially down the street, and it was headquartered in Estonia. And so I worked at Skype for a while, became really fascinated by the freemium business model. So the freemium hadn't really taken root in the West yet at this point. This is like 2010. And I was working at Skype, and Skype was a freemium product. If you remember, it was totally free to use. You could do point-to-point VoIP for free, but you could buy a phone number. So if you wanted someone to call you, it felt as if they were calling your cell phone, but in actuality, they're calling your Skype. And that didn't work that well. And Skype was kind of like a terrible business. But I thought, okay, there's probably ways to apply this business model that are really interesting. And I saw what was happening, across the Baltic Sea in Finland, and free-to-play gaming was sort of just starting to become a category on Facebook Canvas. And so I went and joined a company that was already in the process of failing. That, so this was the moment in time where Facebook Canvas as a gaming platform was beginning to disintegrate. This was when Facebook sort of pulled the rug out from Zynga and took away like the sort of viral notifications mechanic. I mean, everyone remembers that. And mobile was emerging as a gaming platform. And so the company that I joined just, past the point of no return with respect to failure, was just late making that shift. And when they did, they bet the farm on Android versus iOS, which was just a strategic mistake, right? So that company failed. And I was like, okay, joined a startup. It failed. There was another startup that had recruited me. I said, okay, playing a little bit of a risky game here. This mobile gaming business, who knows where it goes? I feel very confident that it will become something big, but maybe it won't. I'm joining another startup. This one's even less well-funded than the other one. So why don't I do this? I really want to take this job because it sounds interesting, but I should just start blogging. And I should start blogging about mobile free-to-play, like the economics of it, in a way that utilizes this fancy degree that I just got, because I'm going to forget all of that information over the course of like the next couple of years. And so I might as well find a way to apply it while it's still fresh in my mind. And so I just started blogging. And I remember I sort of set a goal for myself of writing like 10 articles before I launched the blog. So there's like this locus of content there. And I did that, sort of after work and wrote the blog, and I published it, and people enjoyed it. And I was talking about things like how to predict a user's engagement, like in terms of number of days played from like a retention curve, and how to think about like lifetime customer value, those kinds of things. And then how to promote a game, how to take a game that you have and actually get users for it. And that was just based on Facebook advertising at the time. And so I started writing about these topics, and there was an audience, right? It was mobile game developers, and mobile gaming was a very small category at that time. But nonetheless, there was an audience for it. And then Supercell blew up. So I had moved to Helsinki at this point, whereas I was living in Helsinki. Supercell had actually spun out of the company that I had been working for, the one that failed. And so they were like a competitive startup to the one that I was at. And lo and behold, the startup that I joined did fail again. So here I was, like almost 30 years old. I'd been at 2 failed startups, had no money to my name. I felt like a loser, but I had this blog, and it had a little bit of an audience. It had a little bit of a following. And so what I decided to do was, hey, I'm doing something right. A lot of things I'm doing wrong. I've failed in a number of ways. And keep in mind, at this point, I'm like 28, 29, maybe. My girlfriend and I are pretty serious. I have no money to propose. I'm living in a 25 square meter flat in Helsinki, which sucked. I just feel like an absolute loser. But I had one thing in life that was going for me outside of my relationship with my then girlfriend, now wife, which was that this blog had some traction. So I pitched a couple of publishers about, hey, let me turn this into a book. And one of them took me up on it, Elsevier, which is a well-known academic publisher. So I was like, look, the startup I'm working at now is failing. I can sense that. The startup I just left failed. So let me just put a lot of effort into this. I wrote the book, published the book. It was pretty well received, I think. And then as a result of my blog, a company reached out to me, which was actually very successful at the time in Berlin and ended up exiting for a very impressive amount of money. And they were like, hey, we really like your blog. If you're ever in Berlin, come visit us. And so I happened to be going to Berlin. I met with them, and then they ultimately ended up offering me a job for head of marketing. Because I was talking about, okay, well, you've got this game. How do you get users for it? But I was approaching it in a very systematic way, not talking about build a brand, but actually here's how to construct an ad that is economically productive and run these campaigns. And so worked for them. And finally, felt like, okay, I've joined a company. It's successful. It's growing. I got the book. I have this blog. I should keep, so the blog got me the job. The blog got me the good job. My personality got me the shitty jobs. My personality got me the jobs at the companies that failed, but the blog got me the good job. And so I really should never give this up. I should continue doing this forever. And so I just had a deal with this company. It's like, look, you gave me the job on the basis of the blog. You can't expect me to stop doing it. You have to let me do this kind of in parallel. I promise it'll never affect my work. I promise I'll never do anything to piss off Apple or, well, I promised for the tenure at that job. I didn't promise that in perpetuity. But they're like, okay. And so I kept writing the blog and got, a number of other jobs that were more senior over time and built a career that I enjoyed as an operator. And then, I decided I wanted to start a company, started a company, sold that to a gaming company, joined that gaming company, left after 2 years. And then kind of thought, okay, what do I want to do next? I really enjoyed the idea of investing in companies. And so I started a syndicate. That went really well. But it was a lot of work. And so I decided to start a fund. And so that kind of brings me to today, which is I don't have a 9-to-5 job. I don't go to an office and have a boss or anything like that. But I do a number of things that, make a respectable income. And I get to do what I like every day, every single day.
I would pull out a few things from that. One is, so you went after a very specific niche from the beginning, right? You had something to offer them, and that's mobile marketers and mobile developers. When we started this podcast, right, we wanted to be about go-to-market for ad tech companies, essentially. And I do the same thing for my newsletter, my social content, and so on. Eric obviously has a VC fund based on that sort of premise. So I think there's a lot of value in that. Two is that content provides this amazing foundation for your career, right? It follows you as long as you're able to keep doing it and you don't let any one corporate entity disrupt it. It is something you can do over the course of years, and it'll lead to various businesses, jobs, and it builds over time. Third is that you've found an audience. And I think a lot of people, like you sort of said, there was an audience for it, right? But I'm curious how you got that initial distributions / started to find a critical mass of people, because a lot of people languish in obscurity. And the reason a lot of people try content and then give up on it is because they feel like it's not resonating. And after a few months, they just give it up. So maybe you could talk about how you found that audience and then how it grew over time.
It took a long time to find an audience, or let's say this, it took a long time for the audience to find the blog. I didn't go chasing an audience. I was doing something that I wanted to do, right? I was trying to build an artifact that showcased my expertise in a field that could be put to good use as an operator, right? And I think, you've all heard the term niches make riches. Well, in my case, they don't make riches. They make a income that, you can live on. But at the same time, you've got to enjoy it to be able to put the work in. And I always looked at writing as a mechanism for developing my own expertise. And if that wasn't the case, I wouldn't have been able to persevere at that for as long as I did, because I wrote in absolute obscurity for years and years and years, right? Absolute, a blog post was successful if it got 10 views. And, part of the reason for that was that I was writing about an emergent, incipient industry that had no real demonstrable center of gravity or, long-term sustainable momentum. right? Now, I was talking about mobile gaming at first, but the reality is you could apply what I was writing about to sort of anything within mobile. But believe it or not, at that time, people thought mobile was a fad. I mean, people thought mobile was not going to sort of dominate our lives. Certainly, I would say people underestimated the degree to which the mobile device, almost defines your connection to society now. And everyone would have underestimated that. I certainly did. But I think people underestimated the degree to which mobile would be used in a multitude of situations for a multitude of purposes outside of just, I want to check my email, but I'm not going to write an email on my phone. I want to receive messages, but I'm probably going to write long form messages on my phone. It's uncomfortable, right? I want to look something up quickly if I can do it in a couple of words on Google, but I'm not going to consume information from my phone. And all of those assumptions ended up not being true. The sort of behavioral complex adapted to the form factor, not the other way around. But I think for that reason, there was no audience, or a very limited audience. And in fact, I think, the vast majority of the audience were people that I knew in real life in Helsinki that were working in mobile games. Right now, it was just a stroke of luck that mobile became the centerpiece of humanity's relationship with technology. It's just a stroke of luck. I mean, it may not have happened. I could have been writing about VR at that time. And so, that was just a lucky break. But, I think being successful in anything is probably dependent on a few lucky breaks. So I think, and I hope that if it hadn't worked out that way, I would have moved on to something else. But yeah, I think so. So by definition, there's no audience because that just wasn't an industry that had a lot of people working in it. And now that's not true, right? And so it's just very lucky that things worked out that way. But I do think starting in a niche where you can demonstrate real, genuine expertise, and ideally industry-leading expertise, well, that obviously is going to make it easier to have an audience find you. But I think going to chase an audience is probably the worst possible way to approach this, because if you just don't genuinely enjoy it and want to learn more about it, you're not going to be able to do it on a sustainable pace. And one thing I told myself was, if I can't maintain one blog post a week, I shouldn't be doing this. And I have published one blog post a week, with the exception of 1 week. And I remember that week very clearly. And it was like in 2015. I published one blog post a week since I've started the blog.
It's funny when you were talking about, just how people underestimated mobile, and, how it, eventually, sort of took over everything, including how we, relate to the world. I remember there was, this, expect that as a cliche, and that now might be called a meme. Everybody was like waiting for the year of mobile, while mobile was like, slowly and then quickly taking over their lives, and then ultimately eating everything. There has to be some either moment or strategy or thing that, happened either to you or you figured out that all of a sudden, just brought Eric Seufert to the world. Because I just remember at one point, this might have been a couple of years ago, you were everywhere.
So I think my kind of career, and I mean, it's a function of my personality. It's to be very, very, very aggressively committed to something after having put like a lot of thought into it and come to a thesis, right? And I may ultimately abandon that thesis, right, with new information. But like, I feel like when it's strong opinion strongly held is me. And so I was very, very determined to convince everyone in the world that free-to-play gaming was going to explode in popularity and become the biggest single category of gaming. And it has done that. And I wrote Freemium Economics, my book, in service of that. And to explain why I believe this model was superior for in the mobile context, with the sort of systems that exist on mobile, where the marginal cost of distribution is zero, where everybody eventually will have a smartphone, which they do, right? But this is back then. This was 200 million smartphones, but it would grow to as it has 7 billion, I thought. And so that was me just trying to convince the world of something. And so that sort of evolved until like one day I sort of woke up and I believe Mobile Dev Memo was the singular destination for learning about not just the freemium economy, but also like the mobile economy. And I don't know that wasn't like a moment in time that just sort of like evolved that way. But there was a moment where I realized like, okay, I'm getting invited to speak and give keynotes at all these conferences. And that's because I put this work in and it was a very long process but it grew and grew and grew. But that wasn't a singular moment. There was a moment where I woke up and realized that, right? And started taking it more seriously as a result. The second was ATT. And that's when that was, so if you think about these as concentric circles, that innermost concentric circle was like mobile gaming. That was the mobile gaming ecosystem, the mobile gaming, category that was like, okay, there was sort of like the slow burn. And I realized, hey, I probably am one of a handful of people that is seen as like a thought leader in the space, right? And the second, though, was with ATT. And again, it was a strong opinion strongly held, where it's like, hey, wait a second, this was an afterthought in the WWDC keynote, but this is going to change. This is going to absolutely disrupt the mobile ecosystem, digital advertising, broadly. And I had written actually like a couple months before that, what would happen if Apple would announce that they're going to deprecate the IDFA, right? I wrote like a hypothetical chain of events. There's a piece I wrote. I'm blanking on the name right now, but it was, what happens if Apple deprecates the IDFA or something? And so it was sort of, I wrote this like hypothetical, sort of history, like just chain of events of what would happen. They announced this, let's say they announced this at WWDC, and then the mobile gaming category declines by 20%, and Facebook revenues declined. Like many years before that, I had written a piece about, it was called The Coming War Between Apple and Facebook, and I said one thing that look, these two companies are on a collision course. They're going to collide, and Apple doesn't like the fact that Facebook is the primary distribution mechanism for apps. And for content generally, because mobile has become such a big piece of the content consumption, paradigm, because of the proliferation of smartphones, these two companies are on a collision course. Apple wants to control this, and Facebook completely provides an end run for Apple's gatekeeper status. And one thing that Apple could do to stymie Facebook's growth is deprecate the IDFA. And if they did that, it would be disaster. It wouldn't be just a disaster for Facebook, it'd be a disaster for everyone. I wrote that in like 2016 or 17, right? But anyway, WWDC happens, 2019. There's like this kind of throwaway line about this thing called app tracking transparency, and I just started writing. I remember that weekend, I was just writing. Like, this is going to absolutely disrupt the mobile space, and people were pushing back, like, no, it won't. It's not that big of a deal. You don't think Facebook's thought of this? I said, no. They have thought of this, but guess what? I might have considered the fact that an asteroid will slam into the planet. What's my plan B? There's no contingency there. We're all dead. So let's just hope it doesn't happen. Like, and it turned out that's exactly what Facebook's plan B was. Like, if this happens, what difference does it make anyway? Because we're all, we're going to have to just reconsider and reconfigure our entire company. So that was that kind of, and that was very much a moment. In the aftermath of that announcement, I was like, I need to be screaming from the rooftops about this, because I think not that many people understand it as well as I do, just as a function of my years and years and years of studying it. And so I need to make it very, very clear what the impact of this is going to be. Maybe there's an opportunity to stop it. Maybe there's an opportunity to get some attention to it that puts some pressure on Apple to stop it. That didn't happen. But short of that, I think people need to really prepare themselves for this. And I think that was like a moment in time. And the blog the readership did kind of explode as a result of that.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. Personally, I remember this. And then while you were talking about that, I found the piece. It was published on February 17th, 2020. Called Apocalypse Soon. What happens when the iOS advertising ID is deprecated?
Right. And so WWDC 2020, sorry, I said 2019 before. The WWDC
no, it was 2019. Yeah, it was the end of 2019. And basically what happened, again, I pulled it up. You put together this timeline and checked, there was this throwaway line at the end of 2019, and this is going to change the world. And I think you're right. I think, you had built this incredible body of work over time, established expertise, establish, this idea of, committing to these topics, and found the one. And then that ended up just being right place, right time, the biggest thing that could potentially happen to mobile. And you were in the middle of it.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple other things, that helped to facilitate that. Like, one is I had the body of work, so I'd established the credibility. Because I think a lot of people, understood this. It wasn't just me, right? But a number of people did. But they didn't really have the credibility. It's like, okay, well, tell me why I should trust you. And so when someone said that to me, I could point to 10 years of blog posts. Like, look, I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about this. And then the other was that, I was independent at that point. So I didn't really have, my dog in the fight was just that I really care about the mobile ecosystem, right? And nonetheless, a lot of people did try to, question my motivations. And look, the truth of the matter is I got more consulting work in that year than I'd probably gotten in the 3 years combined. So like ATT was great for me. I was trying to convince people that it should not go forward, but it ended up being really great for me. So like I wasn't talking my book. I was actively trying to undermine my business because the status quo was less lucrative than this frenetic ATT environment, right? But, I had the credibility, and I didn't have the bias of like, okay, well, if someone from Facebook who understood this, was trying to warn people about it, everyone would say, well, yeah, but because your company's going to get harmed by this. But I didn't really have that, that burden. those two things allowed for, kind of, I think, my voice to carry and resonate more than some other people's could because of those two properties.
Look, I think the biggest thing from a marketing perspective for our audience is that like this is what it is to build an audience, like a lot of people who do it the best, they lingered in obscurity for years before, it takes off, and then it takes off through a combination of your expertise, through like the alignment of your audience with those expertise, and through some external events that you can't necessarily control, like, ATT happening and causing a major problem that then your expertise can help people solve. So I think a lot of people, like thought leadership is a much ballyhooed term, right, in business. And the reason is because it's often people regurgitating consensus insights, number one. And then number two, sort of giving it a go at creating an audience, but like getting tired and giving up in like, 3 to 6 months. And that's what almost everyone does. Like I have a client who just started doing this kind of thing. And like, he got like a tweet with 30 likes. And I was like, look, man, 30 likes in your second week of tweeting is pretty good. Like, because I think folks like us who have been creating content forever, and I also have that just sort of writerly disposition. So I've been writing, my entire professional life. Yeah, you just linger in obscurity for years and keep building up credibility and, honing your expertise. And eventually maybe you get lucky enough to break through. With Agamemnon, you sort of glossed over that real quick in your biography. But so that's a company. Tell us a bit about that and how quickly you sold it. Because I think it was like about a year, right? So how'd that come about?
Yeah. So I was at a company called Rovio. I was the vice president of user acquisition and network engagement. Rovio makes
Angry Birds.
They make the Angry Birds games. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And we launched Angry Birds 2, which was a big coup. It was a high-profile launch. It was the biggest launch, I think, in the history of mobile gaming at that point. I got quoted in the Wall Street Journal. I thought that was the coolest thing that ever happened to me. And I did that. And we, I was brought in on sort of like a turnaround basis. It wasn't a very like pleasant environment. The company was sort of in a downward trajectory, and we did turn it around. Launched Angry Birds 2 is successful. We had the movie. I did the mobile marketing for the movie, and I was like, okay, this is great. I was back in Helsinki, which wasn't really where I wanted to be. I had told the exec team when they hired me, look, I'm here for a year. Like, I'm not staying in Helsinki for that much longer. I'd already spent, many years there. Helsinki's great, by the way. I appreciate it much more now as a married father of two than I did when I was, just with my then girlfriend, now wife, because it's kind of boring. But now that it's very appealing because you get like free, I've got a baby, you get free childcare. People work about 35 hours a week. Everyone kind of takes all of July off. The winters are brutal, but the summers are gorgeous. Anyway, safe, it's clean. But, I wanted to be where the action was at that point in my life. But anyway, so I told them I'm good for a year, but after that, there's this idea that I had been kicking around for a long time, and that ended up being Agamemnon. So I left after the year on good terms. I ended up consulting for Rovio after that, but I left on good terms and started Agamemnon, which was, so one thing I want to make clear is it was not ad tech. I've never worked in ad tech. I'm not denigrating ad tech. I just haven't worked in ad tech. I've never worked for a company like Facebook or Google that built ad tech. If I had, I hope I'd be smart enough to not write the kinds of things in emails that Google employees seem to write in emails a lot. But that's an aside. And Agamemnon was not ad tech either. I call it a business intelligence platform. So basically what it was is a mobile marketing teams. One thing I say a lot is you can go broke spending profitably on user acquisition, right? You're buying cohorts that will make back, or they will contribute more money than you paid for them, but not on a timeline that you can bear, right? So, you think about UA and user acquisition, you're paying upfront for cash flows that will be realized over the course of some amount of time, right? And so, we were getting to the point in like the growth of the mobile ecosystem where UA is driving now all growth, right? People had disabused themselves of this idea that things could go viral, and you could have a company building virality moment that just doesn't really happen now, and it did happen, but it was really early in the sort of the life cycle of mobile. Angry Birds is a good example of that. And so you needed to have some sort of platform that could map out your cash flows, and that's what Agamemnon was. So it's like, I'm buying a cohort today. How will the cash flow accumulate over time? And let me map out how much I could spend in 3 days or 6 weeks or 8 months, really map out how much money I can sustainably invest into user acquisition, right? Knowing that I'm going to spend everything up front for the cohort and it's going to be realized over time. And so I started building that, and I was just talking about it, right? On Twitter, and I was talking about it on, the blog, and and I made some videos about it, and they weren't promotional. They were just informative. It's like, hey, this is how you think about this. Cause like it was a topic that was becoming much more relevant in that moment. And so by the time like I was ready to launch, I was building it myself too. I didn't hire a team. I programmed the whole thing myself and was working at the same time, right? This kind of stuff you can do pre-kids. Now I'm lucky if I get like 30 minutes to code after work or, at home. But, I was, staying up all night and pulling all-nighters and doing that kind of stupid stuff that you do like in your, early 30s. I built it, launched it into beta, had like 200 companies instantly sign up. And I was like, wow, people are really using this thing. I was looking at the Google Analytics data, and the average session time was 2 hours because people were using this not just for its like intended function, but they were using it as like their nexus of user acquisition information. This was like their singular dashboard for user acquisition. And I started talking to people and like, yeah, we love this thing because we didn't have anywhere where we could sort of like congregate, if you will, where we could like strategize and think about our user acquisition campaigns. And this is it. And this is like a very basic product too. Like it didn't connect to APIs or anything like that. You had to like manually input data. And so it's like, okay, wow, this could become like a real platform for managing user acquisition across, the entirety of your one app or your portfolio of apps. And it caught the attention of a company that wanted to use it for that purpose. And they're like, hey, we could just pay you as monthly SaaS people. Why don't we just buy this and you come build this for us? And we have this idea of becoming like a platform for not just, growing our own products, but for publishing other people's products. And I like the team. I like the idea. And ultimately what I kind of said I wanted to build, which is this is maybe another idea that's kicking around in my head, and I'll give it away right now. If anybody could build it, feel free. But it's actually like a financial platform for financing other people's cohorts, right? So let's say that I have all my data of past cohort progression in this financial hub. You, a hedge fund, or you, a family office, or you, just an individual investor, you can pay for my next cohort, and you get some premium on that, right? So that's the idea. That's ultimately what I wanted to build at this company. It didn't end up happening that way. Kind of pivoted a little bit. The company pivoted a little bit, but nonetheless, that I joined them, had to move back to the US. I'd been living in Europe at that point for a decade, moved back to the US. There's a whole story there about like my wife getting a visa. Trump had just come into office. He got rid of the expedited visa. So it took my wife almost a year to get her green card. So I was commuting back and forth from SF to London for like a year. That's a whole different podcast episode, but didn't get to build the sort of financial platform, but I've always thought about that. I would love to be able to do that. But anyway, so it was a kind of like a cohort cash flow projection tool, and it was popular, got acquired and joined the acquirer.
That's an awesome story. We'd be remiss not asking you about your view on mobile generally. I think, both today where the opportunities are, but then tomorrow, where does this go with, so much of the, maybe this shows a bit of the bias of where we sit in the ecosystem, things like CTV exploding and obviously AI being, potentially the next platform. Is there a next mobile, or, I'll put words in your mouth, is just everything just continue to be consumed by mobile?
Yeah. I mean, I think mobile, like this, let's say the smartphone is the dominant daily use hardware form factor for my lifetime and there are lifetimes. And so there's no next mobile. I think the use case of mobile expands, right? I think AI is an accelerant for time spent with mobile. I don't see that as, orthogonal engagement track, right? I think you engage with AI on your phone. I do every single day, and you continually do that. I mean, you look at stuff like Apple Intelligence and the tools that they're bringing to market with that. I mean, it's just going to become a bigger part of our mobile experience. And one thing that I think is really fascinating, if you kind of try to think about how privacy and AI and advertising intersect, is that a lot more we're going to have to demand that a lot more of compute happens on our device. I mean, that essentially is the end game for privacy. Is that this all happens on my device, and I don't need my data streaming to some server somewhere. And that, if you accept that, then a lot of the cross-device use cases erode, right? And mobile becomes a much, much more important part of content consumption, content delivery, because all this everything has to happen on your device. And so like one kind of thesis that I have is that AI is sort of like the defining, and I've been writing about this a lot for like the last year and a half, 2 years, but like AI is sort of like the defining application of technology for advertising going forward, right? If you think about the entire life cycle of advertising, or the entire sort of like horizontal supply chain, from creative production to ads optimization to ads measurements, all of that will be managed by AI, and increasingly in real time, and increasingly in ways that are completely personalized to us, right? And so if you think about not like, okay, well, I can go on Facebook and I can create 3 variants of the picture of my company's, the coffee mug that we make, and they have just 3 different backgrounds. Well, okay, that's compelling, and that might boost CTR a little bit. But if you can think about, like, I'm on Facebook and I'm scrolling, and an ad was just created for me using all of the data that Facebook has about my tastes and preferences, as well as all of the data that is available from the on-screen context in this moment. And that ad represents the highest potential opportunity to get me to click for that given product. That's really exciting. To that end, I think, mobile just becomes such a big, important component of that, because all of this that we consume, like the vast majority of the content we consume happens on mobile. That's not going to change. And so if you have to shift all of that compute to the device, then there's a whole lot of new opportunities. There's a whole lot of challenges that emerge as a result of that. But it just makes the mobile form factor, the smartphone, that much more important, right? Because we can't depend on all this stuff happening out in the cloud. And so, like, CTV, yes, I'm really excited about CTV, and it's a growth category. And I think the growth of CTV, the growth of retail media networks, this is my everything is an ad network thesis. A lot of that was catalyzed by ATT, but not just ATT, the continuous hostility coming from these privacy restrictions to the way that this data is used. Well, yeah, then you're going to push a lot more sort of like advertising spend to these other content surfaces. But I think mobile remains the dominant. And so there's no stopping like the engagement on the smartphone device. That's going to be in your pocket for the rest of your life. Now, it may shift some budget elsewhere, but and that's exciting, but that's not moving the engagement there.
Eric, it would seem that privacy changes in the direction that digital advertising has been headed for the past few years would advantage walled gardens, right? Because they have these, I think you've sometimes talked about content fortresses, as you call them, right? Like they have this vast repository of users and first-party data and so on, and they can create scale and they can make digital advertising and growth very easy. You wrote this past week about the relation between AppLovin and Snap, and AppLovin would seem to be, but maybe I'm wrong, bucking that trend of like the walled gardens just winning everything. And AppLovin now has, a market cap more than double the size of Snap's. Just curious for your thoughts on that, and sort of like, do walled gardens eat everything over the next 5 years, or what's the relation between the health of the walled gardens and that of the open web?
Yeah, so one of the points I made in that piece is that AppLovin is a walled garden. You have to redefine walled garden, right? A walled garden doesn't just mean that like I have this, if you become so big and you own so much of the supply chain, you are de facto walled garden, whether or not you have a single app, right? And so Snap, per the sort of like historical common definition of walled garden, Snap should outperform Apple. That's my point, right? Walled gardens should outperform networks, right? Because they have a singular app. They have this direct relationship with the advertiser. They have a privileged access to the data. So you would assume that conventional wisdom would dictate that Snap should outperform AppLovin. Why isn't it? Why is App? And it's far beyond 2x just as a function of this week. I mean, this week's been insane. But AppLovin is up. I wrote that piece like a couple of days before it was published, and AppLovin was sitting at about 87. AppLovin's at 109 today, right? And then we're talking about 10 days. So AppLovin is absolutely on fire. There was a Bank of America change the price target this week. But but based on this conventional definition of an app of a walled garden, well, Snap should outperform AppLovin. Why isn't it? Because the conventional definition of an app of a walled garden no longer holds. AppLovin bought access to the data. They've got privileged access to the data. They bought MoPub. They have the data. They've got better data than Snap has. And Snap couldn't keep up. Snap couldn't get the data. It can't get the data because of the privacy restrictions. Just having the SDK now doesn't mean you have the data. And Facebook adapted before anybody. They navigated this adaptation first. And that's why their stock is on fire too. Because they said, look, having an SDK, that doesn't give us privileged access to the data. We're on equal footing with everyone. How do we get privileged access to the data? Well, we build CAPI. Right? We build CAPI, which is just a way for you to shoot anonymized signals at us. And we'll have to build all the infrastructure that allows us to interpret those signals. AppLovin said, well, we probably can't do it gapping. So let's buy MoPub. Let's own the SSP. Now, we don't have a single app that is the publisher and the ad platform. We don't do that. We can't do that, right? But what we can do is we can own the network and the SSP. We can combine those two things. And if we do that, then we have access to the data. Snap said, now we'll keep the SDK, right? And anyway, ATT is not a threat, right? Evan Spiegel said that. Now, early days, he didn't read Mobile Dev Memo apparently, but, he said, ATTA, we're happy this is happening, right? And they were just very slow to adapt. And so, ostensibly, walled garden should have privileged access to the data. They should have a first-party relationship with the advertisers. They should be able to do things to the advertisers' campaigns that work to their benefit, but also sort of benefit the ad platform. Well, they can't do that. They didn't build that stuff. Facebook did. If you look at AppLovin's business from the perspective of like the historical definition of a walled garden, it's not a walled garden. It's an ad network. It should lag a walled garden. It should not be able to surpass a walled garden, sort of like in terms of efficiency, but it did. There's a new definition of walled garden, and it's just having access to that data. It became a walled garden.
Joe, I can't believe you said the open web. Don't you know this is the man that said the open web is whistling past the graveyard?
I just wanted to get us into a provocative headspace. And I feel like that was, Eric hit his peak engagement level there. He was like, let's freaking go, just talking about walled gardens and the open web. That's what gets Eric going.
Well, I guess the question is, how do you do that within the open web? And I think one of the points I was making in that piece is you just can't. The quality of the data is poor. Now we'll see. I wrote that prior to the Google's cookie announcement, which I think honestly doesn't fundamentally change the outcome. I think ultimately what I wrote at the time when Google made the announcement was that probably Google is going to achieve the same thing, but they get to sort of like wipe their hands of the responsibility. Like we're not deprecating cookies. We're just saying the user can choose to not opt into cookies, but we can massage the language and we can make it like one and done. Well, that sounds an awful lot like ATT.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Look, we should wrap up because we're at time. The main thing I would leave the audience with in terms of the thought leadership angle here and the way, Eric Seufert has used content to build your business is that like there are no hacks, right? There are no hacks. There are no shortcuts. Like you have differentiated expertise. You build up over time. You're very consistent over a long period of time. You talk to a specific audience and, you make progress. And eventually, if you're lucky enough, you do hit a sort of inflection point where something happens or maybe a new distribution channel opens up or something. And then, you really go to the next level. But if you want to win with this kind of strategy, if you really want to win with like analysis and thought leadership and content, it's a long-term endeavor that demands consistency. And the number one obstacle is people get bored, right? They get bored and they don't stick with it.
Yeah, I would double down on that. What you mentioned before about commitment and, strong opinions strongly held. That seems to be like a real differentiator for you. And, what I would, sort of consider folks who are thinking about their own strategy to keep in mind as they create their content and they sort of kind of craft where they're going in the world.
Yeah, I think with content production, you can map like the path to success to the sort of, the old saying with startups is like, how do startups fail? They run out of money. But how does a blog fail? Someone stops publishing. Like you just have to keep doing it. And so you might as well find something that you enjoy because that'll keep the motivation levels high.
Sounds great. Yeah. Eric, where do people find you on the internet?
Well, Twitter, if you have a stomach for it, and mobiledevmemo.com, or, those are the two sort of like primary outlets, I guess. LinkedIn, I publish there, reasonably frequently. It's usually just cross-posting. And then Threads, but I never really kind of found much traction there.
Amazing. Eric Seufert, thank you so much. Folks, if you like this, please, what should they do, Joe?
Smash that subscribe button. As we said last week, we're hungry for your approbation. We need attention. So please like that and come back for similar discussions in future weeks with the luminaries of ad tech and digital marketing.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Eric. Bye, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Bye, guys.
Take care.